Germany, March 1945. A forest clearing outside Hammelburg. The snow is gray here, not white gray, stained from weeks of boot traffic, shell fragments, and things men don't talk about afterward. A soldier freezes mid-step. There are bodies in the ditch. American bodies. But they are not wearing American uniforms. They are wearing nothing but thin cotton undergarments, some torn at the seams, some missing entirely. Their dog tags are still there. That detail makes it worse. Whoever did this didn't bother to take the tags. They weren't interested in identity. They were interested in what the men were wearing. One sergeant kneels. He turns over a face he recognizes. A kid from Oklahoma, 19 years old. He looks up. There's a German command post less than half a mile away, and George S. Patton is already being told about this. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't file a report. He got in the Jeep. This is what he did. We tell stories where disrespect meets consequences. Subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. His name was Oberst Wilhelm Hartmann, German colonel, camp administrator. A man who had learned to survive the collapsing Reich by making himself useful in the ugliest ways possible. The camp under his authority, a converted farm complex near Hammelburg, held several hundred American POWs. Officers, mostly. Men captured during the chaos of the Ardennes push and the weeks following. By any measure, conditions were already criminal. The barracks had no heat. The men were fed once daily. Watery soup and hard bread. Medical care was non-existent. Red Cross packages were seized at the gate and never distributed. But Hartmann had found a new source of advantage. American uniforms were in short supply across the Wehrmacht. Quartermasters were screaming for replacements. Soldiers at the front were improvising with captured equipment. A man who could deliver American field jackets, boots, and wool coats in quantity could earn himself real protection from men higher up the chain. Hartmann understood supply and demand. So when prisoners died, and they died regularly, from exposure, dysentery, despair, their uniforms were stripped before burial, not after the war, not quietly. In front of the other prisoners, the guards would drag a body from the barracks in full daylight. Two men would hold the corpse up while a third worked the jacket off. The boots came next, then the trousers. Whatever remained, undershirt, socks, might be left or taken depending on the quality. Then the body went into the ground. The surviving prisoners were made to watch. Hartmann had calculated the math on this carefully. Terrified men don't organize. Humiliated men don't resist. Humiliated men don't resist. Men who watch their dead stripped like discarded cargo begin to wonder, quietly, in the dark, whether they are worth anything at all. That was the point. This wasn't just theft. It was a psychological weapon, and it had been running for weeks before a single prisoner got close enough to a guard, close enough to a gap in the wire, close enough to freedom to tell anyone what was happening inside that camp. The man who finally made it out walked 7 miles in bare feet before an American patrol found him on the roadside. He was not wearing a uniform. They asked him why. His answer was 3 words. They took him. The patrol brought him to a field aid station. A medic wrapped his feet. A lieutenant took his statement. And within 6 hours that statement had traveled up through channels in the way that certain statements do. Quickly, without bureaucratic delay, because the man writing it down understood that what he was describing was not a supply issue, it was a war crime. The escaped prisoner's name was First Lieutenant Raymond Carr, 35th Infantry Division, captured outside St. Lebbe, VIF in December. He sat on a cot, hands around a tin cup of coffee he couldn't drink because his hands were shaking too badly. "How many men are in that camp?" the lieutenant asked. "Maybe 300, maybe less now." "Less?" Carr set the cup down. Some of them stopped waking up. The statement reached Patton's headquarters the following morning. Patton read it standing up. He didn't sit. He held the paper with both hands and read it twice. The second time he read it slower. The part about the uniforms was underlined by whoever had forwarded it. He handed it to his aide without looking up. "Get me a map of that road." He was already thinking through it, not emotionally, not yet. Tactically, where was the camp? What roads were passable? What forces were in range? How many hours? But there was something underneath the tactical calculation, something visible only to the men who knew him well enough to see it. His jaw had set in a particular way. That particular way meant someone had made a very serious error in judgment. At the camp itself, the morning was proceeding normally, which is to say, brutally. Roll call at dawn. 194 men standing in the cold. 3 failed to stand. They were dragged out by 2 guards and left in the yard. Hartmann appeared at 8 o'clock. He walked the line slowly, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting the men the way a farmer inspects livestock before market. One prisoner, a captain from Alabama, his name was Marcus Webb, held his chin up as Hartman passed. Hartman stopped. He looked at Webb for a long moment. "Still proud," Hartman said. In English. "Precisely." Webb said nothing. "Admirable," Hartman said, and moved on. Webb's jacket was missing its lining. Someone had cut it out weeks ago. For what purpose, he'd never determined. The wind came through the seams. He had learned to stop thinking about warmth. In the barracks, the personal effects of 3 men who died overnight had already been inventoried by a German corporal. 2 pairs of boots, 1 wool coat in decent condition, 1 set of long underwear. The corporal folded the coat carefully. In the corner, a prisoner watched. He was a sergeant named Dillard from Ohio. He'd watched this same process 9 times. He kept count, because keeping count was the only way he'd found to stay sane, to make himself a witness, even if no one ever asked him what he'd witnessed. He didn't look away. He committed the corporal's face to memory. 12 miles west, Patton's Jeep was moving fast down a shelled road. His aide had suggested, carefully, that perhaps a formal request through proper channels would be more appropriate. Patton looked at him. "Those boys are in the ground in their underwear. How formal do you want to be?" The aide did not answer. The Jeep accelerated. There were other things Patton knew that hadn't made it into Carr's statement. Fragments from prior intelligence reports, rumors from partisan contacts, whispers from freed laborers who'd been marched past the camp and seen things through the wire. The uniforms weren't staying local, they were being transported, bundled, sorted, and sent east to rear area depots, to units that would issue them without asking questions. American soldiers were possibly dying at the hands of German troops dressed in American wool. That was the thought that was in Patton's head when the Jeep crested the hill and the camp came into view. He didn't speak. He looked. And then he got out. The gate guards saw him coming from 100 yards out. They had perhaps 10 seconds to make a decision. Challenge the American officer, raise the weapon, do something procedurally correct. They did none of these things. They stepped aside. Patton walked through the gate without breaking stride. His aide, 2 MPs, and an intelligence officer followed. Inside, roll call had already ended. The prisoners were still in the yard. There was no order to return them to barracks. They stood in loose clusters, watching the American vehicles stop outside the wire, watching the men come through the gate, watching the face of the man leading them. One prisoner, older, bearded, barely standing, said it quietly, almost to himself, "That's Patton." The word moved through the yard in seconds. Men who had stopped standing straight began to stand straight. Patton walked directly to the main building. He didn't tour the grounds first. He didn't speak to anyone yet. He moved with the specific purposefulness of a man who had already decided several things before arriving. Inside, Hartman was behind a desk. He stood when Patton entered. Reflex. Patton looked at the desk, then at the walls, then at Hartman. A slow, deliberate sequence. "You are the camp administrator," Patton said. Not a question. "Yeah, yes," Hartman said. "Oberst Hartman said. Oberst Hartman, I must protest this. Where are the uniforms?" Silence. "I don't. 1 word. Don't. 1 word." Flat. Final. Hartman looked at the aide, at the MPs, back at Patton. "There is a storage facility," he said, "at the eastern end. Show me." Hartman hesitated for exactly 1 second. Patton didn't move, didn't speak, just waited with the absolute patience of a man who has already decided this conversation ends one way. Hartman moved. He led them through a side corridor, out a back door, across frozen ground to a low brick outbuilding. The door opened. Inside, stacked crates, shelves along 3 walls. Neatly folded American field jackets, boots in pairs, wool coats, belts, canteens, organized, inventoried, ready for transport. At least 60 uniforms, possibly more. Some still bore the names of the men they'd been stripped from, stenciled in black ink on the collar lining. Patton read one name. His expression did not change. "Get me the prisoner manifest," he said. He turned back to Hartman. "All of them. Every name." It was Sergeant Dillard who told the full story afterward. He said Patton came out of that storage building and stood in the yard for a long moment, maybe 30 seconds, just standing, looking at the prisoners, looking at the building, not speaking. Then he turned to Hartman. "You're going to carry them." Hartman blinked. "I don't." "Every uniform in that building." You, your staff, your guards. You will carry them, by hand, across this yard, and you will lay them at the feet of those men. A pause. Today, right now. There was no debate. Patton's MPs made that clear without saying a word. Hartman walked back to the storage building, and then, in full view of 194 American prisoners, the colonel of the camp, his administrative staff, and 6 of his guards began making trips, armload by armload, jacket by jacket, boot by boot, crossing the yard, laying the items on the frozen ground in front of the men who had survived without them. Nobody in that yard made a sound. Some prisoners looked at the ground. Some looked at Hartman. Some looked at Patton, who stood to one side, arms crossed, watching every single trip. It took 40 minutes. When the last item had been laid down, Hartman stood in the yard, red-faced, breathing hard, uniform dusted with grime from the shelves. Patton walked toward him slowly. He stopped 2 feet away. "These men have names," Patton said quietly. "I'm going to learn every one of them, and so is every court in this army." He turned to his intelligence officer. "Document everything, photograph everything. I want his signature on an inventory before we leave this camp." He walked to the prisoners. He didn't give a speech. He looked at them, each of them, as many faces as he could. "You held," he said. "You goddamn held." That was all. The prisoners were evacuated within 48 hours. Trucks came. Medical personnel came. Field rations, blankets, actual care. The machinery of an army that had finally arrived. Late, but arrived. The machinery of an army that had finally arrived. Late, but arrived. Marcus Webb, the captain who'd held his chin up at roll call, was among the last to leave. A medic tried to help him to a truck. Webb waved him off. He walked to the truck himself. Inside, he sat against the wall and looked out at the camp disappearing behind them, the low barracks, the wire, the frozen yard where something had happened that morning that he was still processing. A private next to him asked if he was okay. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I watched them carry our jackets," he said. "I watched the man who ordered it done carry them himself." He looked out the window. "That'll stay with me." Sergeant Dillard was treated for frostbite and malnutrition at a field hospital near Frankfurt. He spent 3 weeks there. He talked to a chaplain every day. He didn't talk about the cold. He didn't talk about the cold. He didn't talk about keeping count. About the 9 times he'd watched a uniform stripped from a dead man. About the faces he'd memorized. About the promise he'd made to himself. That he would say the names out loud, somewhere, to someone, eventually. The chaplain listened. When Dillard was discharged, he was given back his things: wallet, letters, a photograph of his wife. His uniform was new, issued from supply. He put it on slowly. He buttoned each button carefully. Hartman was taken into American custody that same day. His case was forwarded to the Judge Advocate General's office, where it joined a growing pile of documented violations from liberated camps across Germany. The inventory document he'd signed, in Patton's presence, with his own hand, became Exhibit 7 in the military tribunal proceedings that followed. He was convicted. The charge included deliberate desecration of the remains of American servicemen, systematic theft of prisoner property, and knowing participation in conditions constituting criminal neglect. He served a sentence. Whether it was proportionate to what he presided over, you can decide for yourself. The photographs taken that day of the storage building, of the inventory, of the yard, became part of the documentary record of POW conditions in the final months of the war. They didn't show faces. Patton had insisted on that. The surviving prisoners had been through enough without having their humiliation become historical evidence. What they showed instead was the shelves, the careful stacks, the pairs of boots lined up in rows, the field jackets folded with a neatness that was somehow more disturbing than disorder would have been. Somebody had taken time with this. Somebody had organized it, maintained it, run it like a system. Back in that field hospital, Lieutenant Carr, the man who'd walked 7 miles in bare feet, was asked by a reporter from the Stars and Stripes if he wanted to make a statement about his captivity. He thought about it. "I want people to know," he said, "that the men who didn't make it out, they didn't disappear. Somebody counted, somebody remembered, and somebody came." He paused. "Somebody always came." The reporter wrote it down. Outside the hospital tent, it was starting to snow again. This time the snow was white. This wasn't just about uniforms. It was about whether a man could be reduced to nothing. Strip away the rank, strip away the clothing, strip away the warmth, the dignity, the visible evidence that someone lived and served and mattered. Do that long enough, systematically enough, and maybe the men watching begin to believe it. Maybe they forget what they are. Hartman understood that. It was his strategy. What he didn't account for was a different kind of man, not the man in the Jeep, not the general with the stars and the temper and the legend. The man counting. The prisoner in the corner of the barracks who watched every time, who kept every name, who refused to stop being a witness even when witnessing cost him something. Dignity is not something you wear. It cannot be stripped from a body or folded onto a shelf. Those men in that yard, cold, sick, reduced in every physical way, were never less than what they were. Patton didn't restore their dignity that morning, he just made it visible again. And sometimes, when everything else has been taken, that is enough. So I want to ask you something. If you had been in that yard, if you were the one keeping count, watching, remembering, refusing to look away, what would you have done when those trucks finally came? Would you have gotten on, or would you have stood there a little longer, making sure the count was complete? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. And if this story hit the way I think it did, subscribe. Because we're not finished. There are more yards, more names, more men who held, and someone needs to keep telling their stories.